Good evening, everyone. Can I get your attention, please? Nothing like commanding the audience. Can I get your attention? Thanks, Paul. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Speak Up Newport, our October meeting. Speak Up Newport's the Newport Beach Forum for discussion of civic affairs. We put on 10 programs a year. We also sponsor the annual Mayor's Dinner, and we award college scholarships to Crondale Mar and Newport Harbor seniors. Now we have a few VIPs in the audience here tonight. First of all, former Mayor Keith Curry. Keith, there's Keith. And also Mayor of Costa Mesa, Katrina Foley. Thanks for coming, Katrina. And then also, just a special announcement, all our food is provided to us by the Bungalow every month, and we appreciate that. Hope you enjoyed that. But just a special mention for Jim Walker, the owner of the Bungalow. He's been awarded the Newport Chamber of Commerce Businessman of the Year this year. So congratulations, Jim. All right, well, our speaker this evening is our Congressman Harley Rouda, and board member Deborah Allen is going to introduce Harley.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. We do have some seats down front. If you folks standing up in the back want a seat, we'll scoot you in, okay? Yes, I'm Deborah Allen, and it's with great pride that I introduce our congressman. Congressman Rouda was elected to Congress in 2018, first political campaign he ever ran. He was a successful businessman and had a vision to make politics and policy making work again for families in Orange County. He's a freshman, of course, congressman, and dedicated to working with both Democrats and Republicans to basically get things done in Washington. He believes working together, our nation can tackle critical challenges such as the climate change issue, crumbling infrastructure, homelessness, Social Security, and Medicare. He believes that we can have health care and prescription drugs available and a world-class college education attainable for all people. As far as the career, he is a leader dedicated to growing business and driven to creating and supporting thousands of jobs. He holds an MBA from Ohio State University, a JD from Capital University Law School. He lives in Laguna Beach, married to award-winning author, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this name right, Kara Rouda, and they have 4 children. Enough from me, Congressman Rouda.
Thank you. Great to be here with you tonight. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, we had 4 kids, 5 and under, so I learned to bellow at a very early age. I think a lot of you have maybe never met me before or heard me speak. Is that true? A few have, a few haven't. So for those that you have, I apologize for repeating myself on a few things, but for those that haven't, let me give you a very, very brief background on myself, why I decided to run, and what Washington, D.C. is like. Quickly on my background, I am born and raised Columbus, Ohio, so I am a true Buckeyes fan. Please don't hold that against me if you're originally from Michigan. Thank you. And grew up as the youngest of 4 kids. My dad started a business in the basement of his first home with an old door resting on 2 sawhorses. He built it into Central Ohio's largest residential real estate firm. After going away to college and then going to law school, I practiced law for a very large law firm, doing corporate securities work, real estate, and intellectual property. I never thought I'd go to work for my dad again because I did that growing up, and I used to kid him that he violated all the child labor laws by making his kids work in the business. But in hindsight, it was a good experience, and realized my dad did not really have a succession plan. So I came to work for my dad in 1990, And in 1996, I realized that the real estate industry was ripe for consolidation because of this new thing called the internet. And in Columbus, Ohio, there's a company that some of the older folks here remember, CompuServe, was based in Columbus, Ohio. So I was able to attract a couple executives and engineers from CompuServe, and we built a really cool technology platform that allowed us to have significant organic growth, then attract capital, so that we ended up in 2002 doing a roll-up of 14 companies and creating the fourth largest independently owned residential real estate firm in the country. From there, we began franchising across the United States. And we dealt with the real estate Great Recession that began in 2006, but got through that, and eventually we sold our franchise company that we now had expanded into approximately 20 states to a company called Brookfield. Some of you might have heard of Brookfield Homes. They're a large conglomerate out of Toronto. They had bought the GMAC real estate network in the United States. I came on board, merged two franchise systems together of about 10,000 people, and then 3 years later we sold it to Berkshire Hathaway. So that's my business background. As mentioned, I've been married for 29 years. We have 4 incredible kids that keep us busy all the time. We just got back from Yosemite with our 4 kids and just had an absolute blast up there on a long weekend. And nobody told the rest of the country that this is supposed to be the off season because it was packed in Yosemite. I'll tell you that, but we had a wonderful time. So why I decided to run was the 2016 election. And what might surprise you, it wasn't just about Trump. I was born and raised a Republican. I was a Republican for approximately 20 years and then almost 20 years as an independent before becoming a Democrat. I tend to be a centrist in my views and believe that the only thing the way to get things done is to bring people together. And what I saw in the 2016 election was anything but us coming together as a nation. That election came down to personalities. And I truly believed our founders wanted us to talk about issues and to fight for what you believe in, but ultimately reach across the aisle and put community and country first. And I truly believe most Americans are between the 20-yard lines, that we have a heck of a lot more in common than what separates us. But unfortunately, the media and many politicians tend to focus on what separates us, and to some degree, we tend to buy into it, unfortunately. So I made the decision to run, that we need more moderates in politics, whether it's at the state level, federal level, or local level. We need to get rid of this partisanship and try and again, fight for what you believe in, but compromise at the end of the day if there's a compromise to be had. Didn't know if that would work, but that was the idea. Common sense for common ground was our tagline. As mentioned, I've never run for office before in my life. And as a recovering attorney and businessman, I will tell you this is the biggest decision I've ever done with the least amount of due diligence, which is probably a good thing. But lo and behold, we beat a 30-year incumbent. And when I say we, it was we. This was a team effort in the truest sense. At the general election, up until the general election, we had 8,000 volunteers. And so I want to point that out because when like-minded individuals fight for what they believe in, anything, whether it is local issues here or whether it is changing a member of Congress, you can accomplish great things by putting your mind to it and working with your fellow citizens. And that is one of the great things about our democracy, that even a 30-year incumbent in a district that has leaned Republican since day one, that if you have values that resonate with those who vote, you can make a difference. So let me tell you what Washington, D.C. is like. Washington, D.C. is more bipartisan than you would think, and it's more partisan than you would think. And let me tell you what I mean by that. From a bipartisan standpoint, we have passed 292 bills in the House of Representatives to date. 292. The vast majority of them are bipartisan. Right? They are. But what you're not going to have happen is Fox News, CNN News, or MSNBC breaking news, 435 members agreed on blank. It's not going to happen. They're going to always bring the news that divides us. Now, unfortunately, I will point out of the 292 bills that have passed, only 15% have passed the Senate. And that's unfortunate because there's some very good bipartisan bills that are at the feet of Mitch McConnell and the Senate that need to be passed. And the one that is so important to me is the bipartisan support for background checks on gun purchases. That has to get passed by the Senate. I also want to share with you what my office has done. And I've got a great team. Laura Oatman, our district director, is standing right here. I think many of you know Laura. Shannon's in the back. We have Shannon wave. I'm not sure if anybody else is here. Lauren is in the back here as well. Thank you. So between OC and DC, we have an incredible team that keeps me very busy. So to date, we've had 5 town halls. This does not qualify as a town hall. And don't ask me why. There's a lot of rules around what we are allowed to call a town hall and what we're not allowed to call a town hall. But we've had 5 town halls. 9 hearings as chair of the Environmental Subcommittee of Oversight, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. 18 measures have been passed by my office, 33 measures introduced, 284 constituent cases closed, 355 measures co-sponsored, more than 60% bipartisan, 1,044 tours, 1,000 plus meetings, 759,000 recovered for constituents, and 26.2 million in grant funding secured so far. It's good. So I serve on 2 committees. I serve on Transportation and Infrastructure and Oversight. You could not be on 2 more different committees. Transportation and Infrastructure is very bipartisan. It's a lot of camaraderie. It's civil. We are trying to address the infrastructure issues that impact all of us across America. Oversight, which job is to investigate the administration, by literally the terms of the Constitution, investigate the administration in the White House and hold them accountable to taxpayers and citizens, is just the opposite. I jokingly say members should probably be checked for weapons before they take their seat, because all we do is argue, and it's a lot of hypocrisy. Case in point, we had a recent situation, and it was a situation that was similar to a situation that occurred about 8 or 10 years ago, and if you heard the comments today, you could have taken those comments from the Republicans and Democrats and literally flipped them over 6 years ago. It's the exact opposite, and that's one of the reasons I decided to run, because the hypocrisy in D.C. is pretty deep, to say the least. There's a lot of folks will argue whatever they think is best for the party, and not necessarily consistent with how they've argued in the past. I do want to cite a few specific bills that we have been involved in that I think are important. One is H.R. 206. It's the Encouraging Small Business Innovation Act. It allows small businesses to, generally speaking, the government will ask for universities, is typically the situation, to address a situation. We have a need, could be a software, could be a product, we have a need, can you solve it? And the academic institution will then create a plan of action and prove that they can theoretically do it. And the next step is they get a grant, a second grant to follow through, do it, and if they prove it out, then they get a government contract, which is kind of a cool thing, right? Well, the idea of this bill is to extend it to small businesses. Give small businesses, who we believe also have the expertise, just as many academic institutions do, to fight for those government dollars, grants, 1, and 2, government contracts. And so this bill requires these government agencies to give small businesses a shot at getting those funds. It's almost like investment banking from the federal government. It also requires a significant percentage to go to women-owned and minority-based businesses. These 2 programs should contribute about $34 million to California's 48th district businesses from the time that it was implemented with these tweaks. So that's an important piece. Another piece of legislation I've introduced is H.R. 1317, the Coastal Communities Adaptation Act. We have, because of climate change, we have rising seas, we have greater number of king tides. Anybody live on Balboa Island? Yeah, okay, so you know why the wall was raised. It wasn't because people were mistakenly falling into the bay. It was raised for reasons much more serious than that. This bill provides coastal communities such as Newport Beach the ability to get grant funding to figure out the master plan that you will need to address climate change in the years and decades to come. HR 1929 permanently extends the qualified fuel cell motor vehicles credit. HR 2570 is the PFAS User Fee Act of 2019. That acronym PFAS is an acronym for perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl chemicals. If you haven't investigated PFAS chemicals, please do so. This is a huge environmental issue and it's growing every day. PFAS chemicals are, they're called forever chemicals. They're called forever chemicals because they are bioadditive. When you get them in your bodies, they stay in your bodies. They cannot be broken down and taken out of your tissue. And these have not historically been regulated. So much has been in clothes we buy, food packaging, or simply dumped into our watershed. And if you follow what's going on in this area, you'll know that California just did a study of all of the water districts in the state to see which water districts are below the recommended EPA threshold of parts per trillion. 40% of the water districts in California failed. So the challenge is these chemicals are getting in not just to water, but into our food supply and food chain as well. And the only way to get it out of the water supply is through, there's a few technologies, but the preeminent technology is reverse osmosis, which is basically a desalination plant. And we know how expensive desalination plants are. So this is a real issue. We're trying to make sure that the companies that have created these chemicals are responsible for cleaning it up. And to put this in perspective, we had three of the leaders of three major chemical companies in front of my committee just about a month ago. And one of the executives was with 3M. And with 3M, they are the original inventor and producer of the perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl chemicals. They gratuitously stopped producing them in the early 2000s. Highly profitable business that they stopped producing. Why? Because the internal documentation that they have showed what the long-term health implications were for Americans. And they just recently settled an $875 million lawsuit with the state of Minnesota. So when I tell you this stuff is serious, it's serious, and it deserves all of our attention. And all of our attention means getting educated and understanding what we're facing and why we need to move faster on it. HR 2739 is the TIVSA Act. It's the Transportation Infrastructure Vehicle Security Act. And this evolved out of my work in TNI. And basically this bill, which is bipartisan and bicameral. So, and by the way, all these bills I'm telling you are virtually, I believe every one of them is bipartisan author with me in promulgating this legislation. TIVSA is more unique in the sense that it's bipartisan and bicameral. We have both support in the House with Republicans and Democrats, as well as Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. This bill prevents basically U.S. taxpayer money to be used to purchase Chinese manufactured buses and rail systems. And the reason is that there's obviously some concerns about China long-term as a responsible player in the international economic markets. And China has a history of doing state-sponsored enterprises or state-sponsored organizations. And basically what it is, it's a state-owned industry or companies that underprice the other companies bidding for whatever it may be to basically take over that market. So case in point, Australia. 90% of the domestic production of buses and rail cars in Australia have now been taken over by Chinese companies because the Australian domestic market could not compete at prices that were 20 to 30% less through these Chinese companies. The fear is that China will do the same thing to the United States if we don't stop it. And I think everybody can appreciate from a national security standpoint how important it is for us to be able to control our bus stock and, more importantly, our rail stock, especially in times of potential hostilities. And that's why it's so important that we make sure that any bus and rail systems in the U.S. are friendly. The last thing I'll touch on as well on legislation is a couple different bills I've got pending to address the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis, the federal government has, in a bipartisan way, put money aside to address it. Unfortunately, we're not seeing those results. We're projected to see 70,000 opioid overdose deaths again in 2019. To put that in perspective, that's more than all of the men and women in service that we lost in the Vietnam War in 1 year. And again, the same as last year, 70,000 individuals. So the legislation that I'm working on helps bring greater transparency and accountability to how those federal funds are being used. One of the ways is simply where we're deploying funds, let's find out what's working and what's not working. Because if a community here has something that's working and a community here doesn't, let's make sure we know so that we can get those funds transferred and in programs implemented that can address that issue. The author of one of the two pieces of legislation is Mark Meadows. And I don't know if anybody here knows who Mark Meadows is. Mark Meadows is a Republican with the Freedom Caucus. I point that out because, again, you can find bipartisan opportunities to address issues in our country. 70,000 deaths by opioids is neither a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It is an issue for all of us. And when we work together across the aisle, we can solve these issues. I'm proud to be working with Mark Meadows on that legislation. Last thing I'll share with you before I open it up for questions. I was at a presentation by Arthur Brooks, if I recall correctly, was his name. He's a writer, a libertarian, and there's a lot of things I agree with him on and a lot of things I don't agree with him on, but I appreciate his passion for trying to do the right thing. And he asked an audience two questions, the same two questions I'm about to ask you. The first question he asked, raise your hand if there's somebody that belongs to the other party that you love. Great. Second question he asked was, raise your hand if you believe our country would be better served with only one party. Exactly. Same thing happened. Not a single hand went up. And I think those are two great questions for all of us to keep in mind as we debate issues, as we fight for what we believe in. Recognize this country is better served when we do not have contempt for people on the other side of the aisle, but continue to love them. And equally important, making sure that we're willing to work across the aisle and recognize that two healthy parties is better than a one-party system like communist China has. So with that, I'll open it up. You can ask me any questions you like.
Okay, please wait for the microphone when you get called on.
Thank you. Welcome, Congressman. My name is Charles Klob. At a town hall that I attended of yours, I believe you stated something to the effect of where NextGen has been implemented in other parts of the country, cities there have the same issues with it as we do. Can you enlighten us on what progress you might be making to get that addressed through the FAA?
Sure. NextGen, this is specific to the noise and air pollution from John Wayne Airport. NextGen is an FAA process that went into effect for airports across the country. And basically what it created was highways in the sky. And the idea is that it would be safer, more secure, and less expensive for dedicated routes in and out of airports. What that did, and while those three things may have been addressed in that regard, what it also eliminated was the historic fan approach of flights coming in and leaving. And so what happened is that though, when you have a fan approach, everybody suffers a little bit from the airport noise and pollution. But when you go to dedicated highways in the sky with long approach and takeoff patterns being set, certain neighborhoods now feel virtually the entire brunt of the noise and air pollution. And Newport Beach clearly falls in that regard. So that is what Next Gen is. We are getting ready to sing Sweet Home Alabama. So Next Gen, what we're experiencing here in these communities, other communities are experiencing the same thing. And so we're working with the FAA to see what can be done to modify it. There are certain things that we can help at the federal level, but a lot of it sits at the local county level in the decisions that are made. And so for my part, I'm trying to get the FAA to do two things. One, do a study, another study to address or better understand the noise. And second, I would like to see how they, the finding process, how they find companies for excessive noise be revisited. My understanding right now is that if you take any airline, the flights they've had in any given month, the noise levels are prorated, so that if 50% of them are over the noise threshold and 50% are less than the noise threshold by the same percentage, there's no violation. And I believe any flight that is over the threshold should be fined, right? And I think that would go a long way in getting the airlines to make sure that they're meeting noise thresholds and addressing the issue. Did that? Yeah. Yeah, we'll choose that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I'd like to move along. I wish there was more that could be done. Many people feel that the old takeoff, which was fast and high, was more friendly. And I know about the local attempt to do that, but the airlines can lean now on the FAA saying, well, we don't have to do that anymore. And that isn't really controllable at the county level. They'd like it to be, but it's really not. It has to be done with volunteer unless there's a federal mandate through FAA.
Let me look into that. My understanding is they still have to meet the noise abatement. So usually if an airline, a specific aircraft is doing, they usually come on, the sound system, the pilot tells you that here in Orange County, we hit the gas. They literally hold the brakes, hit the gas, and then go fast. I think that's driven more by aircraft type and engine type than anything. But we'll dig in deeper for sure. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. He's moderating the question, so.
Pardon me, Congressman, I want to clarify something for our audience. The reason we need you to speak into the microphone with your question is this is being taped for TV. And in order for your voice to come across on the TV, we need to have you on the microphone. Otherwise, the TV audience only hears the congressman's answer, which probably is more important, but in context, it needs your question as well. So thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you.
Is this on? So it was encouraging to hear you talk about the bipartisan work that you've done. You know, we get a little shielded out here by the news outlets and how biased they become. What I'd like to know from your perspective, though, is what is your confidence level that the logjam will break loose on all these bills that have gone through the House and are sitting, you know, at the Senate? Or do you think it's going to take truly a change in the administration?
It's a great question. And to repeat the question, will we break the logjam of legislation sitting at the feet of Mitch McConnell? Only Mitch McConnell can ultimately answer that question. And you know, I like to study history, and I like to make sure that when I see something like I have, where only 15% of the bills have been passed by the Senate, I want to put that in a historical perspective, because I think it's important that if that is consistent with historical norms, then we should know that. So I went to the most recent Congress, where we had a Democratic president, Democratic Senate, and a Republican-held House. And in that time frame, and that was Harry Reid as head of the Senate, 40% of the bills passed by the Republican House were passed by the Democratic Senate. So I do think fault lies at Mitch McConnell's feet. And until we as citizens across the country start demanding more action, and again, I will emphasize the bipartisan bill to provide national background checks. 90% of Americans support that legislation. And you know, you can't get that legislation passed due in part to the fact you've got an inordinate amount of dark and soft money coming into these races. And so the gun lobby has spent $54 million just in the 2016 election cycle, plus tens of millions of dollars more going to campaigns and lobbyists. Now, I've taken a pledge. I do not take corporate PAC money. But when you see individuals, when you see individuals in Congress who know 90% of Americans want background checks, and that the majority of the people in their district want background checks, yet they are taking significant contributions from the gun lobby, it's unfortunate that they're not going to vote the way we'd like to see them vote.
Thank you for the bipartisan job you are doing in Washington. I appreciate that.
Can I say one other quick thing, though?
Yes.
You know, H.R. 1 was a bill that was also passed by the House, and that bill provided to basically clean up the amount of dark and soft money coming into these elections and providing transparency. Because frankly, our democracy does not operate well when you have this kind of dark money coming in. And I apologize, I just take one more quick second on this. The 2010 Citizens United decision that said corporations are people too. Anybody here ever held hands with a corporation? Anybody ever made out with a corporation? Now, I have been told other things have happened to them from a corporation before, but I won't repeat that. But the point is, in that decision in 2010, the Supreme Court, in the majority decision, said they did not think that their decision would cause more dark, soft money to come into the election process. In 2010, when they made that decision, $140 million of dark money was in the election cycle. In 2016, it was $1.6 billion. So if we do not get Citizens United addressed and get more transparency and accountability for corporations who are making contributions to candidates to basically buy their vote, we're unfortunately going to continue to see politicians unwilling to do what even 90% of Americans want them to do.
Our house is burning down due to climate change, and I would like to hear what you see in Washington in terms of both the acceptance of that fact and any actions that are being prepared to address that fact.
So I'm going to take a little bit longer time on this answer because I'm fortunate that I chair the Environmental Subcommittee of Oversight. It's highly unusual for a freshman to chair a committee. It's even more unusual for a freshman to chair a committee that has subpoena power. The number one thing that we're looking at, in addition to PFAS, in addition to the wildfires in California, in addition to the spent nuclear waste sitting in San Onofre and 100 other sites across the United States, the main area we are focused on is climate change. We are doing 3 phases of hearings: past, present, and future. Past, what did we know, when did we know it, and why didn't we do anything about it? Those hearings have already shown us that Exxon in 1978 and Shell Oil in 82 had internal documentation clearly showing that excessive use of fossil fuels would cause the ambient temperature of our environment and atmosphere to heat up and cause potential for more severe weather events. The second phase is the present, understanding clearly what is the economic and human cost associated with climate change. Economic cost is fairly easy to understand what the cost of the hurricanes in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, or the flooding in Texas, or the wildfires in California. The human cost, unfortunately, can be easily calculated to some degree as well. How many people have died? How many people have lost their homes? How many people have been displaced? It's harder to figure out the health impact, but that's also what we're drilling down on, is understanding the economic health cost associated with climate change. And then third is the future, understanding clearly what is the two choices we have, the apocalyptic road or the nirvana road. And the reason we're going through this process is because for many people, they don't understand or appreciate the full impact of climate change long term. So let me share a couple things with you. The current estimates right now are 200 million plus climate change refugees by 2050. This is the largest mass migration of humankind since World War II. Why? Because where we've built our homes and our farms and our cities are all based on predictable weather patterns that we have had over the last 1,000 years. When you change predictable weather patterns by raising the ambient temperature of the atmosphere by a few points Celsius, you shift those historic weather patterns so that where we have built our homes, our farms, and our cities are no longer in the right place. Obviously, this is an infrastructure issue well beyond the widening of the 405. And that's why you're even seeing now, when resources are scarce, when you do not have access to food and water because of changes in your climate, you have refugees. And again, that's why there's 200 million climate change refugees estimated by 2050. It's also why the Department of Defense has recognized climate change as the #1 national security threat. I tend to not think of the Department of Defense as a bunch of left-wing leaning individuals. So when the Department of Defense says this is a national security threat, we should all take that to heart. And also the Department of Defense is dedicating hundreds of billions of dollars to upgrade defense installations around the world so that they can better handle these more severe weather events taking place. Again, I point that out because anytime the Department of Defense has raised the warning bells to this level, all of us should be very concerned. So our goal in these hearings is to overcome two primary narratives and hopefully get to an appropriate outcome. The two primary narratives that I fight are we can't afford to address climate change. And by clearly showing analytically the cost of these more severe weather events, both in economic and human cost, we're able to clearly show that doing nothing is actually more expensive than doing something. So that's the one narrative we've got to overcome. The second one is, I call it the toddler narrative. The toddler narrative is, why should we do it if China and India aren't going to do it? I'll tell you why. Because we are the greatest country on the face of the earth, and we have an obligation to be a leader, especially in something that's this important to our entire planet. And the United States is #1 per capita in production of CO2, not China. The United States produces more CO2 per capita than any other country. India, I believe, doesn't even make the top 10 right now. The fact is, we have to address climate change. And new industries and new technologies are going to be developed to address climate change. I would like to see the United States on the forefront of that battle, creating those jobs here, exporting that technology internationally so that we continue to have the most secure, economically vibrant economic base in the world, and not chagrin our obligations to the rest of the world by not being willing to do what needs to be done. One other item I will add to this is that the best opportunity to lead us to this outcome are energy companies. Because right now, for every dollar in incentives we provide for renewables, we provide $80 for fossil fuels. So if we simply had parity, we know energy companies would help lead the way in developing and implementing clean, green technologies. Because an energy company's job is to do two things: produce energy and deliver it to those who need energy. And it's not about fossil fuels per se, it's about driving shareholder wealth. So if creating more windmills and wind generation and more solar drives shareholder wealth, then that's what they'll do. So let's get the economic incentives in the tax code aligned with the behavior we want to create the outcomes we deserve.
Okay, well, everyone said a whole lot of stuff, and now I want to ask more than one question. But anyway, Congressman, you talk about climate change and all these things. I'm sorry. But what about King Trump? Can he just smush it? Because so far, I've not seen anybody that's been able to pass anything that he does not believe in. And that's a huge concern for me in a gazillion different issues, but certainly climate change is one of the most important.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I too am concerned with the lack of commitment by the administration to addressing climate change. Obviously, abdicating our leadership role in the Paris Climate Accord, many would agree was a mistake. And just so you know, in the Paris Climate Accord, when the Paris Climate Accord was signed, every single country on the globe was a partner to that accord with the exception of two countries, Syria and Nicaragua. Since the United States has left, those two have joined. So now we have the United States, again, the mantle of leadership historically for the world since World War II, abdicating its leadership in arguably what's the most important issue facing humankind, longevity. The good news is we are seeing local municipalities and states step to the table to address this, as well as businesses. I think one of the coolest things I saw in the last few weeks was the CAFE standards that California has for automobiles. We have a higher standard of emissions than the federal level. Many other states follow the California level. And the Trump administration is trying to prevent California from having and maintaining those higher standards. And I think the really cool thing, I believe it was 5 major auto manufacturers, worldwide auto manufacturers, basically said, we're still going to honor the California standards.
Thank you very much. My other question was, a lot of people in Newport Beach are like really, really angry about our homeless. However, if they traveled very far, they'd see we don't have near the problem other cities do, in my personal opinion. But isn't that, I mean, it's a national crisis because it's happening everywhere in our nation, but is there anything that you and others can do to change things? Because you look much further than Newport Beach when you look at all of your issues you have to deal with, and we're just a baby thing. Is that a city thing that needs to be done? Because people keep saying, oh, Rouda should have done this, and quite frankly, I don't think that's fair. I think that, you guys can laugh, but I don't think that's fair. I mean, to me, it's a local thing, not
I can answer that.
council.
I can answer
Council thing. I
Yeah,
thought there
I got it.
Was
Yeah,
there not a
let
question?
me,
Is there anything you can do?
Sure. Let me tell you what I can do and what I am doing. This is an issue that's near and dear to me. My wife and I started a shelter for homeless families when we were in our 20s. We recognize that many people, you lose your job, you can't pay the mortgage, you lose the house, you stay in a hotel, you run out of money, and then you live in your car for a while, and then you make the very difficult decision of going to a shelter. Often shelters still send women and children 15 and younger to the women's shelter, and the fathers and the older boys to the men's shelter. When all they have left is each other, you're breaking up the family unit. So my wife basically decided that's going to stop in our community, and we built a shelter for homeless families. Many of the people who are homeless, if not all of them, are not homeless by choice. They either have chronic mental illnesses that are not being adequately addressed, they have addictions that aren't being addressed, or they have fallen on hard times and need a hand up. This is a four-legged chair to address it. It requires local, state, and federal coordination with private partners. Locally, many of the municipalities are taking action. We need a better partner at the county level who is sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars available to address mental illness that your tax dollars have gone to fund but are not being deployed. In addition, the state. We have passed measures at the state level to address homelessness. Those funds have only recently been received, but they too need to be deployed faster than they're being deployed, in my opinion. And then third, the federal government. We have seen the federal government fail in a couple areas here. One is the voucher program. The voucher program allows low-income individuals to use a government voucher to help subsidize or abate their rent. Often they cannot find housing in time before the voucher expires, or certain landlords won't take the voucher. In addition, there's not enough vouchers to go around, so we have many vets who are homeless who desperately need these vouchers but can't access them. I am supporting a bill that provides $13 billion at the federal government level over 10 years that can be used to help local and state agencies address homelessness and hopefully eliminate it. But fourth, we also need private partnership here. Private partnership, private partners often have the knowledge, expertise, and ability to move faster than government does. You would agree. And as we see with this issue. And I'm very heartened by what I've seen with the Salvation Army do in Anaheim. Anaheim was having some significant issues, and through a public-private partnership in the speed of which they established beds to address the homeless in that area, as well as the longer plan to build a hospital for those that are facing chronic mental illness is also part of the process. I think it's a good example of that public-private partnership that can help other communities as well. I will be participating in a town hall on homelessness this Saturday in Laguna Beach, and I know that my office is scheduling another one for the foreseeable future. It's an important issue. Thank you for raising it. And one last thing I'll raise on this too is also sober homes. Sober homes is directly tied to this as well. And if anybody's here from Costa Mesa at one point, I know Mayor Katrina Foley's here. Mayor, where are you? Mayor left. She's got a few other things she had to do. But Mayor Katrina Foley has been really fighting hard to address this issue. Costa Mesa had over 200 sober homes. These homes take advantage of the American with Disabilities Act and the ACA to recruit addicts from around the country to come to our communities. They receive 6 months of benefits while the sponsor receives 6 months of revenue from under the health care, provide less than adequate health care, and then the term is literally curb them. They put them on the curb at the end of 6 months, adding to our homeless population and failing to address the addiction that these individuals so desperately want to have fixed. Yes?
All right, so as a surfer, I've been kind of concerned about the stuff happening along our coastline, such as, like, specifically the nuclear waste being stored off San Onofre, and then in our local community, the sand being moved from river jetties to 44th Street and C Street, I believe. So I just want to know kind of like what's going on to, first off, remove the nuclear waste from San Onofre, and then just inform us on what's going on in Newport.
Okay, great question. I apologize, it's not a really quick answer, especially San Onofre. So I've had several hearings on this, both in-field hearings down at the plant, the decommissioned plant, which is in Mike Levin's district, but we are in the theoretical kill zone if there was a nuclear catastrophe there. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of approximately 100 sites across the United States. Why is spent nuclear fuel sitting in 100 different places in the United States? Because there's no long-term repository for it. Why is there no long-term repository for it? This is how, I'm going to share with you how I found out. So I'm meeting with experts, and the first atomic nuclear power plants came online in the United States in the late 50s and early 60s. In the late 60s, there was this discussion began as to what do we do with the spent nuclear fuel. And that's when I asked the guy, time out. We were building the plants before we knew what we were going to do with the spent nuclear fuel. And he said, sort of. The answer is yes on one hand, but the belief was there was never going to be any spent nuclear fuel because the nuclear power age is going to be so significant that nuclear power plants were going to be built anywhere and everywhere such that all naturally forming plutonium and uranium would be used so that market-based factors would make the spent nuclear fuel valuable to reuse. Does that make sense? So once we use everything up that we mine, and this is all that's left, we'll pay to reuse that, even though it costs a lot more than what was in the ground. Well, you throw a 3-mile island in a Chernobyl at the world community, and they say we don't want any more nuclear power plants to speak of. So obviously the spent nuclear fuel is not going to be reused because we have large deposits still worldwide for the existing power plants that are out there. So what happened was the United States put all of its eggs in one basket, Yucca Mountain in Nevada, that all spent nuclear waste was going to go to Nevada. Guess what? Nevada doesn't have any nuclear power plants. And they don't want anybody else's spent nuclear fuel. And I can see why they might have that opinion. And so that became an issue, and that has basically been taken off the table to a large degree. So the question is now, what do we do? So Mike Levin and I are working on honestly, I find it somewhat frustrating to think that 2 freshman members of Congress are addressing a 50-year-old issue because former politicians have failed to do it. So I'm working on introducing legislation that would provide market-based economic models that would have communities bid for the nuclear waste because they have the geological underground environment capable of managing to take it, and 2, they want it, and 3, they see the market value in receiving it. I know it sounds perhaps astonishing to think anybody would want it, but the only way you're going to have any community willing to take it is because you've created a market-based reason for them to take it instead of trying to shove it down their mountain like we did in Yucca Mountain in Nevada. So that process is, we're working on drafting that legislation, and hopefully it will go somewhere. Even if it does get passed, you are realistically talking best case at least 10 years before you would even start to see nuclear waste removed from San Onofre. Because in addition to having a long-term repository, you also have to then deal with the logistics of transporting massive amounts of spent nuclear fuel from 100 different sites around the country to their long-term resting place. And then as far as, I think your second question was just on Newport, and really just, I think the watershed here, when the pollution from the watershed into the ocean.
It's like sand removal, so basically they're just moving the sand from the river jetties, basically, which is obviously not the cleanest sand or water, and they're just putting it in different spots, like we're putting it in 44th and then C Street.
Okay.
And I was just wondering
Okay.
what the whole project was.
I'll dig in a little bit deeper on that one.
All right, we have time for one more question, Harley, back here.
Okay.
Good evening. This is not as much a question as a compliment for you. I know you advocate trying to mitigate or solve the climate crisis. but you failed to mention that you signed on to H.R. 763. And I want to let everybody know here that it's a landmark piece of legislation. We hope it passes. I'm a member of the Climate Lobby, and our holy grail was to get that passed. And it was introduced in November and is moving through. And we'd like to thank you for signing on to that bill.
Thank you. Thank you. And to give a little bit more background on that bill, again, this is using economic market forces. I always talk about smart capitalism and good government's what we want. We want those two things working together. And this bill basically recognizes that CO2 has an expense associated with it, our health, our environment. And that if there is a tax on CO2 and a dividend for those who are impacted by increased cost in the consumption of CO2, then you're properly pricing the cost of using those fuels. And that's what this bill does. It has strong bipartisan support, and hopefully we'll get it over the finish line at some point. Thank you again for allowing me to come here and speak with you. I'll share one more thing with you before I call it an evening. We work long hours, both in DC and OC. Myself, my staff. In DC, we generally get home from about 6 o'clock to about 9 o'clock. I'm being driven around from one event to another where you pop in and you say a 5 or 10 minute speech, and then to the next event, to the next event, to the next event. You then have the opportunity to go home. And as you're going home, this is the time when I have the most poignant moments, because it is then you can see the capital of the United States lit up in all of its grandeur from just about anywhere as you're driving home. And only 12,000 people have ever served in the House of Representatives. And it's those moments where we're humbled. We're humbled to know that your hopes and aspirations rely on me and 435 other members doing the right thing, fighting for what we believe in. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Congressman. The Congressman's staff has said that he can stick around to answer a few more questions from everyone, so if you have some, stick around. Next meeting is going to be November the 20th, and the subject's going to be the RENA numbers. Those are the state-mandated housing numbers that the city's faced with, maybe up to 5,000 new homes. So November 20th here. Good night.
Say yes to questions. I said yes to photos. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought she asked if we could take some photos.
Oh.
I didn't.